Hello everybody, this is Shannon. I'll be displaying my vinyl collection and I will be just saying the titles and if they are new or vintage. If they're new, that means they're in perfect condition. I bought them recently. If they're vintage, it means I can't guarantee the quality. They're more sentimental albums that I love and all of them are available. Occasionally I'll see an album and I won't announce it. I'll put it aside, which means that it's basically a gift and I won't be selling that. All right, and let's get started. I'm just going to say the names of the album. I won't say anything about them because I'll transcribe this audio file into copy so people can see them in print as well. Aphex Twin, newest release EP. Acid Camp All-Stars, Volume 1, new. Acid Camp All-Stars, Volume 2, new. Richard D. James album, Aphex Twin, new. I Care Because You Do, Aphex Twin, new. 20th Century Women soundtrack, new. Tony Allen, Lagos No Shaking, new. Acetone, 1992 to 2001, new. Africa, Amanaz, new. Animal Collective, Sung Tongs, new. Tori Amos, Boys for Pele, new. Best of the Animals, new. Best of the B-52s, Dance This Mess Around, new. James Blake, The Color in Anything, new. Kate Bush, Never Forever, new. Kate Bush, Lionheart, new. Beck, Güero, new. Beck, Güerolito, new. Jorge Ben, new. Black Mountain, In the Future, new. The Breeders, Pod, new. The Breeders, Last Splash, new. Burial, Untrue, new. Scary Monsters and Super Freaks, David Bowie, new picture disc. James Brown, Motherlode, new. James Brown, In the Jungle Groove, new. Blind Faith, new. Bon Iver, 22 A Million, new. Caribou, Swim, new. Cat Power, The Covers Record, new. The Roots of Chicha, Psychedelic Cumbias from Peru, new. The Chemical Brothers, Brotherhood, Definitive Singles Collection, new. The Cure's Greatest Hits, new. Olatunji, Drums of Passion, new. Dark Side, Psychic, new. Toward the Within, Dead Can Dance, new. Random Access Memories, Daft Punk, new. DFA Compilation No. 1, new. Debussy, La Mer, Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun, new. Bob Dylan, Blonde on Blonde, new. The Very Best of Electric Light Orchestra, new. My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, Brian Eno and David Byrne, vintage with excised track. My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, new expanded version, David Byrne and Brian Eno. Club Sodad, Cesaria Ovorov. The Field, The Follower, new. Fleet Foxes, Crack Up, new. Aretha Franklin's Greatest Hits, new. Aretha Now, new. Whoops, gift, not available. The Fall, A-Sides, new. The Flaming Lips, Greatest Hits, Volume 1, new. Aretha's Greatest Hits, new. Very cool Fortet album that's too trendy to have a title on it, new. Late Night Tales, Fortet, new. Funkadelic, reworked by Detroiters, new. Shaky Graves and the Horse He Rode In On, new. And the War Came, Shaky Graves. Gang of Four, the Warner Brothers compilation, A Brief History of the 20th Century, new. Jose Gonzalez, Veneer, new. Vestiges and Claws, Jose Gonzalez, new. Mulatu, As Take, and the Heliocentrics, Inspiration, Information, new. Lady Sings the Blues, Billie Holiday, new. James Holden, DJ Kicks, new. Iron and Wine, The Shepherd's Dog, new. Iron and Wine, Our Endless Numbered Days, new. Ifrakia Electrique, new. Joy Division, 1977 through 1980, Substance, new. Closer, Joy Division, new. Grace Jones 12-inch Fever, new. Jackmaster DJ Kicks, new. Music to Draw To, Satellite. Kid Koala featuring Emiliana Torini, new. Angelic Kidjo, Remain in Light, new. Kraftwerk Computer World, new. Critter and Dorfmeister, The K&D Sessions, new. Liars, new. Wish You, Liars, new. The Curtain Hits the Cast, Low, new. A bunch of 45s, lounge music from Amoeba Records grab bag, new. Vintage. The Moon in Antarctica, Modest Mouse, new. This is a long drive for someone with nothing to think about, Modest Mouse, new. Everywhere in his nasty parlor tricks, Modest Mouse, new. Building nothing out of something, Modest Mouse, new. Armed Audio Warfare, Meat Beat Manifesto, vintage. Be the Cowboy, Mitski, new. The Existential Soul of Tim Maya, new. Bonkwana Star from Kinshasa, new. The Best of Mantronics, new. She Hangs Brightly, Mazzy Star, new. Seasons of Your Day, Mazzy Star, new. Juana Molina, Halo, new. Power, Corruption, and Lies, New Order, new. In an Airplane Over the Sea, Neutral Milk Hotel, new. I Do Not Want What I Haven't Got, Sinead O'Connor, new. Who is William Onyeabor, new. Pirate's Choice, Orchestra Balbo, new. Wide Awake, Parquet Courts, new. Je ne regrette rien, Edith Piaf, new. Compilation. Portishead 2, Portishead, new. Portishead 3, Portishead, new. Powell, new. OK Computer, Deluxe Version, Radiohead, new. Hail to the Thief, Radiohead, new. A Moon-Shaped Pool, Radiohead, new. The Residents commercial album, new. Red Hot and Fela, new. Blood Sugar Sex Magic, Red Hot Chili Peppers, new. The Best of Otis Redding, vintage. Let It Bleed, Rolling Stones, new. Persona, Rival Consoles, new. Sonic Youth, Daydream Nation, new. Experimental Jet Set Trash and No Star, Sonic Youth, new. Bad Moon Rising, Sonic Youth, new. Or Alexander Spence, new. Cool Shackleton Untitled Album, new. Classic Sugar Ross album that I can't pronounce. Very, very cool, new. The Age of Odds, Sufjan Stevens, new. Come On Feel the Illinois, Sufjan Stevens, new. The Greatest Gift mixtape, outtakes, remix, and demos from Carrie and Lowell, new. Sufjan Stevens. Juju, Susie and the Banshees, new. Nina Simone in Concert, Emergency Ward, new. Introduction to Elliott Smith, new. Suicide, new. The name of this band is Talking Heads Live, new. The Trentemøller Chronicles, Trentemøller, new. Lost, Trentemøller, new. Late Night Tales, Trentemøller, new. Life is Good on the Open Road, Trampled by Turtles, new. Electric Warrior, T-Rex, new. Carry On Crawler and the Dream, EP, DOCs, new. Amasakul, Tinariwen, new. Elwan, Tinariwen, new. Stars and Satellites, Trampled by Turtles, new. The Source, Ali Farka Tour, new. Dub No Bass With My Head, Underworld, new. Rhythmic, Luke Vibert, new. Araka Azul, Caetano Veloso, new. Towns Van Sant, new. What Is Hip, remixed classics from the Warner Brothers Vault, new. Lost in the Dream, The War on Drugs, new. The Transfiguration of Vincent, M. Ward, new. Back to Black, Amy Winehouse, new. Yankee Hotel Foxtrot, Wilco, new. Songs in the Key of Life, Stevie Wonder, vintage. Under the Big Black Sun, X, new. 80 to 85, yellow, new. I can hear the beating as one. I can hear the heart beating as one. Yo La Tengo, new. And these are my box sets. Prince Forever, Prince, 4 vinyl, new. Goo, deluxe version, Sonic Youth, new. Dirty, deluxe version, Sonic Youth, new. An anthology of folk music, vintage. All Things Must Pass, George Harrison, new/vintage. Love is Hell, deluxe album, deluxe box set, Bryan Adams, new. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, Broadway recording, vintage. Bach, box set, Great Men of Music, vintage. Congotronics, collectible, 10 vinyl box set, new. The Andrews Sisters, vintage. Syro, Aphex Twin, new. Classic Acid, the original house sound of Chicago, vintage. Acid House, Jive Presents, vintage. Tony Allen, Never Expect Power Always, new. The Stars We Are, Mark Almond, vintage. The Rough Guide to African Roots Revival, new. The Rough Guide to African Disco, new. Original soundtrack Amadeus, vintage. Atoms for Peace, Amok, new. Torment and Toreros, Mark Almond, vintage. America's Greatest Hits, vintage. Mr. Heartbreak, Laurie Anderson, new. Big Science, Laurie Anderson, new. Strawberry Jam, Animal Collective, new. Merriweather Post Pavilion, Animal Collective, new. Whammy, B-52s, vintage. Morning Phase, Beck, new. Revolver, Beatles, new. Abbey Road, Beatles, new. Mr. Music Head, Adrian Belew, vintage. Bonk, Big Pig, vintage. Station to Station, David Bowie, vintage. Low, David Bowie, vintage. Paul's Boutique, Beastie Boys, vintage. Blood, Sweat, and Tears, vintage. Bon Iver, new. For Emma, Forever Ago, Bon Iver, new. Brazil Classics, at 20, Brazil Classics, Anti-Aging Solutions, new. The Return of Tom Z, The Hips of Tradition, Brazil 5, new. Fourroy, Brazil Classics 3, new. Belize Tropical, compiled by David Byrne, Brazil Classics, new. Live and Low Down at the Apollo, James Brown, vintage. The Hounds of Love, Kate Bush, vintage. The Dreaming, Kate Bush, vintage. The Sensual World, Kate Bush, vintage. Bootsy Collins, The Human Race Is Now, EP, vintage. Trout Masked Replica, Captain Beefheart and His Magic Band, new. Tracy Chapman, vintage. Combat Rock, The Clash, vintage. Heaven or Las Vegas, Cocteau Twins, vintage. Treasure, Cocteau Twins, vintage. Colors of the Day, The Best of Judy Collins, vintage. Gravest Hits, The Cramps, vintage. Psychedelic Jungle, The Cramps, vintage. The Carpenters, singles, vintage. Chronicle, Creedence Clearwater Revival, vintage. The Ecstatic Music of Alice Coltrane, vintage, or new. The Ecstatic Music of Alice Coltrane, new. Crosby, Stills and Nash, vintage. Deja Vu, Crosby, Stills and Nash, vintage. So Far, Crosby, Stills and Nash, vintage. Microphonies, Cabaret Voltaire, vintage. Electropunk to Technopop, Cabaret Voltaire compilation, new. Code.
I don't know that one.
Code, Cabaret Voltaire, new. Happily Ever After, The Cure, new. Stars and Topsoil, Cocteau Twins compilation, new. A Love Supreme, John Coltrane, new. Neither Fish Nor Flesh, Terence Trent D'Arby, vintage. John Denver's Greatest Hits, vintage. Miles Davis, Greatest Hits, vintage. The Essential Miles Davis, new. Christ. Duty Now for the Future, Devo, vintage. The Best of the Doobie Brothers, vintage. Weird Scenes Inside the Gold Mine, The Doors, vintage. The Soft Parade, The Doors, vintage. Bob Dylan's Greatest Hits Volume 2, vintage. Another Side of Bob Dylan, vintage. Bob Dylan, vintage. Bringing It All Back Home, Bob Dylan, vintage. Blood on the Tracks, Bob Dylan, vintage. The Greatest Hits, Eagles, new. Porcupine, Echo and the Bunnymen, new. Heaven Up Here, Echo and the Bunnymen, vintage. More Blank Than Frank, Brian Eno compilation, new. Before and After Science, Brian Eno, vintage. Tonight, Eurythmics, vintage. Sweet Dreams, Eurythmics, vintage. Touch, Eurythmics, vintage. Bete Noir, Brian Ferry, vintage. Truth and Soul, Fishbone, vintage. The Best of Ella Fitzgerald, vintage. Rumors, Fleetwood Mac, vintage. Shuttered Room, The Fix, vintage. Fleet Foxes, new. Helplessness Blues, Fleet Foxes, new. I Love You, Honey Bear, Father John Misty, new. You're Dead, Flying Lotus, new. Tusk, Fleetwood Mac, vintage. Maggot Brain, Funkadelic, new. Al Green's Greatest Hits, new. Fearless, Nina Hagen, vintage. Nunsex Monk Rock, Nina Hagen, vintage. Handel Water Music and Royal Fireworks, vintage. The Real Folk Blues, Howlin' Wolf, new. Dreamboat Annie, Heart, vintage. Music for Torching with Billie Holiday, vintage. If you can't please your soul, if you can't please yourself, you can't please your soul. Some Bizarre label compilation, new. Bad, Michael Jackson, vintage. Thriller, Michael Jackson, vintage. Control, Janet Jackson, vintage. Oil on Canvas, Japan, live, vintage. Surrealistic Pillow, Jefferson Airplane, vintage. The Essential Jean-Michel Jarre, vintage. Zuluk, Jean-Michel Jarre, vintage. Morning and Evening, Fortet, new. Aqualung, Jethro Tull, vintage. The Best of Jethro Tull, vintage. Nightclubbing, Grace Jones, vintage. Pearl, Janis Joplin, new. Tumbleweed Connection, Elton John, new. Elton John, Honky Chateau, vintage. Janis Joplin in Concert, vintage. Discipline, King Crimson, vintage. The Compact King Crimson compilation, vintage. Physical Graffiti, Led Zeppelin, new. Led Zeppelin, new. Led Zeppelin 4, new. Led Zeppelin 2, Deluxe Edition, new. Houses of the Holy, Led Zeppelin, new. Sound of Silver, LCD Sound System, new. American Dream, LCD Sound System, new. Confuse the Marketplace, EP, LCD Sound System, new. This Is Happening, LCD Sound System, new. Les Blanks, Shoot the Horse, vintage. Secret Name, Low, new. Mr. Heart Attack, Liars, new. The Very Best of Gordon Lightfoot, vintage. If You Could Read My Mind, Gordon Lightfoot, vintage. Motherlode, Loggins and Messina, vintage. The Best of Friends, Loggins and Messina, vintage. Love and Rockets, vintage. MC Light, Cold Rock a Party, vintage. The Lonesome Crowded West, Modest Mouse, new. Jam Lely, Baba Mal and Monsieur Tech, vintage. The Turning Point, John Mayall, vintage. Mahler Symphony No. 9, new. Double Nickels on the Dime, The Minutemen, new. For the Roses, Joni Mitchell, vintage. Joni Mitchell, vintage. Blue, Joni Mitchell, vintage. Ladies of the Canyon, Joni Mitchell, vintage. Hijira, Joni Mitchell, vintage. The Hissing of Summer Lawns, Joni Mitchell, vintage. Miles of Isles, Joni Mitchell, vintage. Hijira, Joni Mitchell, vintage. Arular, MIA, new. Kala, MIA, new. Moondance, Van Morrison, new. On the Threshold of a Dream, Moody Blues, vintage. Stevie Nicks, The Wild Heart, vintage. Greatest Hits, Nilsson, vintage. A Poke in the Eye with a Sharp Stick, Pig, vintage. The Best of the Pointer Sisters, vintage. Instinct, Iggy Pop, vintage. Zombie Birdhouse, Iggy Pop, vintage. Brick by Brick, Iggy Pop, vintage. Pop Will Eat Itself, EP, vintage. Pop Will Eat Itself, This Is the Day, This is the Hour, This is This, vintage. The Panda Bear Meets the Grim Reaper, Panda Bear, new. Voice of The Best of the Pixies, Wave of Mutilation, new. The Pretenders, vintage. Prokofiev, Itzhak Perlman, vintage. If I Should Fall from Grace with God, The Pogues, new. Prince, vintage. Lovesexy, Prince, vintage. Batman, Prince, vintage. Around the World in a Day, Prince, vintage. Sign of the Times, Prince, vintage. 1999, Prince, vintage. It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back, Public Enemy, vintage. All Hail the Queen, Queen Latifah, vintage. Sheer Heart Attack, Queen, vintage. Kid A. Amnesiac, Radiohead, new. Kid A, Radiohead, new. Radiohead, BBC Sessions, new. In Rainbows, Radiohead, new. Rolling Stones, Sticky Fingers, new. Sucking in the 70s, Rolling Stones, new. The Rolling Stones, Goathead Soup, vintage. Made in the Shade, Rolling Stones, vintage. Royal Crescent Mob, Spin the World, vintage. Santana's Greatest Hits, new. Saturday Night Fever soundtrack, vintage. Scritti Politti, Cupid and Psyche, new. The Genius of Ravi Shankar, vintage. Untitled Shackleton, Parts 1 and Parts 2, new. Shinehead, Unity, vintage. Oil and Gold, Shriekback, vintage. Scriabin, vintage. The Infinite, Shriekback, vintage. Bookends, Simon & Garfunkel, vintage. Simon Garfunkel's Greatest Hits, vintage. Snow Crazy After All These Years, Paul Simon, vintage. Songs from the Void, Susie and the Banshee, new. To Be Kind, The Swan. To Be Kind, Swans, new. Gaucho, Steely Dan, vintage. Sly and the Family Stones, Greatest Hits, vintage. Snap, The Power, vintage. Evil, Sonic Youth, new. Hits Are for Squares, Sonic Youth compilation, new. Patti Smith, Horses, vintage. Yo Yo Yo, Spank Rock, new. Raw Power, The Stooges, vintage. The Rite of Spring, Stravinsky, vintage. Gish, Smashing Pumpkins, new. Keep on Moving, Soul to Soul, vintage. Nebraska, Bruce Springsteen, vintage. Steppenwolf 2, vintage. Stereo MCs, EP, vintage. Stephen Stills, vintage. Life's Too Good, The Sugar Cubes, vintage. Teaser and the Firecat, Cat Stevens, vintage. The Suburbs, Credit in Heaven, vintage. Dreamhog, The Suburbs, vintage. Naked, Talking Heads, vintage. More songs about buildings and food, Talking Heads, new. Remain in Light, Talking Heads, vintage. The Anthology, A Tribe Called Quest, new. Tackhead Sound System, vintage. Gorilla, James Taylor, vintage. Sweet Baby Chains, James Taylor, vintage. Television's Greatest Hits, 70s and 80s, vintage. Soul Mining, The, vintage. The Low Spark of High Heeled Boys, Traffic, vintage. Dylan Thomas, Read by the Poet, vintage. Three Dog Night, Golden Biscuits, vintage. Tom Tom Club, vintage. Sarah Vaughan's Golden Hits, vintage. Luke Vibert, EP, vintage. My Love is a Bulldozer, Venetian Snares, new. Wall of Voodoo, vintage. Call of the West, Wall of Voodoo, vintage. The Wee Papa Girls, The Beat, The Rhyme, The Noise, vintage. Talking Book, Stevie Wonder, vintage. Original Musicarium, Stevie Wonder, vintage. Harvest, Neil Young, vintage. Paul Young, No Parlay, vintage. After the Gold Rush, Neil Young, vintage. Yellow, 1 Second, vintage. Best of the Youngbloods, vintage. Y4K, Freakin' Nasty, vintage. And that's it.